Jake Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The Galactic University of Advanced Sciences sprawled before him like a fever dream designed by someone who'd never heard of right angles. Crystalline towers twisted into impossible spirals, floating platforms drifted between buildings that seemed to exist in more dimensions than his human brain could process, and the whole campus pulsed with a soft blue light that made his teeth itch. "Welcome to Guas, human specimen," came a voice that sounded like a computer having an existential crisis. Jake turned to see what he assumed was Professor Vextallen, though calling this thing a professor felt generous. The creature looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a filing cabinet and given it a superiority complex. "Just Jake is fine," he said, hoisting his duffel bag higher on his shoulder. The bag, packed with what his acceptance letter had called primitive Earth materials for cultural exchange, suddenly felt very heavy. "I am Professor Vextallen, administrator of interspecies academic integration." The alien's mandibles clicked in what Jake hoped was politeness rather than hunger. "I trust your journey from that backwater solar system was not too traumatic for your underdeveloped neural pathways." Jake bit back his first three responses and settled for a smile that his mother would have recognized as dangerous. "Oh, it was educational. Really helped me appreciate the finer things in civilization." They walked through corridors that seemed to shift when Jake wasn't looking directly at them. Other students floated, slithered, and occasionally phased past them. Jake noted a slug-like creature hunched over mathematical equations that hurt to look at, an insectoid being whose movements were so precise they made Swiss clockwork look sloppy, and what appeared to be a walking boulder taking careful notes with a stylus that looked comically small in its massive hand. "Now then," Vextallen continued, consulting a holographic clipboard that materialized from thin air, "let us review the essential regulations that keep our institutions safe from primitive barbarism. First and foremost, absolutely no firearms are permitted on campus grounds." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Define firearm." "Surely even human education covers basic terminology." Vextallen's tone could have frozen helium. "Any device that uses chemical combustion to propel projectiles. We are civilized beings here, not savages waving clubs and throwing rocks." "Right," Jake said slowly, and something in his voice made the slug creature look up from its math homework. "So just to be crystal clear, we're talking specifically about chemical combustion for projectile propulsion." "Obviously, though I suppose I should not assume human comprehension extends to obvious concepts." Vextallen's mandibles clicked in what was definitely condescension. "Our weapons policy exists because some species have yet to evolve beyond such crude methodologies." Jake nodded thoughtfully, and if Professor Vextallen had spent any time around humans, he might have recognized the expression of someone filing away very important information for later use. "The slug person is Zorp, our mathematics prodigy," Vextallen gestured dismissively. "The insectoid is Krita, who has never scored below perfect marks. The geological formation is Blundoke, whose species takes every statement with absolute literal precision." "Noted," Jake said, watching Blundoke carefully write down every statement with absolute literal precision in his notebook. "Your dormitory assignment and class schedule are loaded onto this communication device." A small crystal materialized in Jake's hand, immediately syncing with his brain in a way that felt like someone rearranging his furniture while he slept. "Try not to embarrass your entire species more than necessary." As Vextallen glided away on whatever passed for feet beneath that filing cabinet body, Jake looked around at his new classmates. Zorp had returned to equations that seemed to be solving themselves. Krita was organizing her notes, with movements too fast for human eyes to follow, and Blundock was still writing down everything Vextallen had said, word for word. Jake grinned. These aliens had no idea what they'd just signed up for. 3 days later, Jake found himself in advanced applied physics, sitting in what he generously called a chair, but which felt more like an abstract sculpture having an identity crisis. The classroom itself defied several laws of physics that Jake was pretty sure still applied, even out here in the galactic boonies. Professor Quantamara materialized at the front of the room, and Jake had to admit that was actually pretty cool. The professor appeared to be made of pure energy contained in a vaguely humanoid shape, crackling with what looked like controlled lightning. When she spoke, her voice resonated from somewhere beyond the normal spectrum of sound. "Today, class, we begin our semester project," Professor Quantamara announced, her form pulsing with what Jake assumed with academic enthusiasm. "You will design and demonstrate a projectile propulsion system capable of achieving both accuracy and substantial kinetic impact. However, as befits beings of higher evolution, you are strictly forbidden from using primitive chemical explosives. Around the room, alien students began vibrating, glowing, or making whatever passed for excited noises in their respective biologies. Zorp left a trail of mathematical equations in the slime behind him as he shifted in anticipation. Krita's multifaceted eyes were already calculating trajectories at superhuman speed. Blundoke raised a massive stone hand. Professor Quantamara, when you say substantial kinetic impact, please provide precise measurements for evaluation criteria, Blundock rumbled, in a voice like grinding consonants. Excellent question, Blundock. Your projectile must be capable of completely destroying a reinforced durasteel target at a distance of 50 meters. Jake leaned back in his impossible chair and raised his hand. Quick question about the rules, Professor? The energy being's form flickered with what might have been annoyance. Yes, human Jake? When you say no chemical explosives, are we talking about the same definition as the campus firearms policy? Just chemical combustion for projectile propulsion? Obviously, Professor Quantamara's voice carried the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. We are civilized beings, not primitives hurling rocks with gunpowder. I expect to see anti-gravity accelerators, plasma propulsion systems, quantum tunneling devices, technologies that demonstrate intellectual sophistication, not the crude barbarism your species is known for. Zorp gurgled what Jake was learning to recognize as laughter. Perhaps the human could fashion a slingshot from animal hide and wood branches, he said, leaving acidic burn marks on his desk from amusement. Or maybe bang rocks together until something happens, Krita added, her mandibles clicking in rapid-fire mockery. Jake nodded slowly, that same thoughtful expression crossing his face. So just to be absolutely clear, Professor, the restriction is specifically on chemical combustion, not on other forms of stored energy or mechanical systems? Correct, though I hardly expect a human to comprehend the distinction between sophisticated energy manipulation and primitive fire-making. Professor Quantamara's form brightened with smug satisfaction. Your species has barely mastered controlled explosions. I doubt you possess the intellectual capacity to devise anything approaching actual technology. Right, Jake said, and his smile could have powered a small space station. Just wanted to make sure I understood the parameters correctly. The professor assigned lab spaces and due dates, then dismissed the class with a wave of crackling energy. As students filed out, discussing plasma matrices and gravitational field generators, Jake lingered behind. Professor, he called out, one more question. Are there any restrictions on the materials we can use, as long as they don't violate the chemical combustion rule? Use whatever resources you require, human Jake, though I suspect you will find our materials library quite beyond your primitive comprehension. The energy being flickered with what Jake was pretty sure was the universal sign for, this conversation is beneath me. Perfect, Jake said, and headed for the door. As he left, he could have sworn he heard Professor Quantamara mutter something about, at least this will be amusing to watch. Behind him, Zorp was already sketching plasma conduits, Krita was calculating anti-gravity field equations, and Blundoke was methodically listing every possible interpretation of substantial kinetic impact in descending order of destructive capability. Jake whistled as he walked to the materials library. He had some research to do, and he was pretty sure the university's definition of primitive was about to get a serious reality check. The materials library turned out to be less library and more interdimensional warehouse managed by a helpful AI that spoke in soothing tones and materialized whatever Jake requested with disturbing efficiency. While his classmates were requisitioning exotic matter and quantum field generators, Jake's shopping list was raising some eyebrows. Requesting clarification, the AI said in its perpetually calm voice. You have asked for wood, metal cable, counterweights, and what you term basic mechanical hardware. Are you certain these primitive materials will suffice for advanced physics coursework? Oh, I'm very certain, Jake said, running his hands over a beautiful piece of hard wood that would have made Earth carpenters weep with envy. Trust me, this is exactly what I need. Word of Jake's unusual material choices spread faster than gossip in a small town. Within hours, aliens were making detours past his assigned workshop space to observe the humans' adorable attempts at engineering. Jake had set up in one of the larger labs, claiming he needed space for proper mechanical clearances, which only added to the mystery. Zorp slithered by daily, leaving trails of increasingly complex equations as he calculated plasma acceleration coefficients. Human Jake, he gurgled during one visit, I have solved the energy distribution problem for my plasma cannon. It will achieve 17,000 meters per second muzzle velocity. What velocity will your wooden contraption achieve? Oh, I'm not really worried about muzzle velocity, Jake replied, carefully measuring angles with tools that looked positively medieval compared to his classmates' holographic design systems. I'm more focused on kinetic energy transfer and target impact dynamics. Krita buzzed past with her collection of precision-machined anti-gravity components. Human Jake, your construction appears to be some form of lever system? Surely you understand that mechanical advantage has been obsolete for millennia. See, that's where you're wrong, Jake said, testing the tension on a cable that could probably tow a small spacecraft. Mechanical advantage never goes obsolete. It just gets forgotten by people who think complexity equals sophistication. Even Blundock wandered over to investigate, his geological bulk requiring the workshop's reinforced flooring. Human Jake, please clarify the operational principle of your device. I observe counterweights, fulcrum points, and what appears to be a launching mechanism, but the physics seem elementary? Elementary, yeah, Jake grinned, adjusting what would have been instantly recognizable to any Earth historian as a pivot mechanism. Sometimes the best solutions are the ones that have been working for thousands of years. By the end of the first week, Jake's workshop had become an unofficial tourist attraction. Aliens would hover outside, making what passed for confused noises in their various languages, while Jake assembled his creation with the methodical precision of someone who'd actually read the engineering manuals. Professor Vextalin made regular inspections, his filing cabinet body clicking with bureaucratic suspicion. During one visit, he spent 20 minutes examining Jake's work with sensors that could probably detect individual atoms. I find no evidence of chemical propellants, Vextalin admitted grudgingly. No energy storage systems beyond basic mechanical potential, no banned weapons technology. He paused, mandibles clicking in frustration. What exactly is this contraption supposed to accomplish? It's a gravitational potential energy conversion system, Jake said with a perfectly straight face. I store energy in an elevated mass, then convert that potential energy to kinetic energy through controlled mechanical release. The counterweight provides mechanical advantage while the lever arm amplifies force delivery to the projectile. That sounds unnecessarily complicated for what appears to be a simple lever, Vextalin observed. Hey, you wanted sophisticated engineering terminology, Jake shrugged. I'm just trying to fit in with all the advanced physics talk around here. The alien students had started placing bets on whether Jake's device would function at all. Zorp was giving odds of 1,000 to 1 against the human achieving basic projectile launch. Krita had calculated that Jake's primitive mechanical system couldn't possibly generate sufficient force to damage a reinforced target. Even Blundock, with his species' literal-minded approach to problem-solving, had concluded that wooden lever mechanisms lack the energy density required for substantial kinetic impact. Jake just kept working, humming Earth songs that probably hadn't been invented yet in most of the galaxy. He'd reinforced stress points with metal brackets, calibrated his counterweight system with mathematical precision that would have impressed even Zorp, and test-sealed his creation with practice projectiles that left very satisfying dents in the workshop's reinforced walls. On the night before presentations, Professor Quantamara materialized in Jake's workshop for a final inspection. Her energy form crackled with what Jake had learned to recognize as barely contained academic superiority. Human Jake, I must admire your persistence in pursuing this quaint approach, she said, her voice resonating with condescension. Though I fear tomorrow's demonstration will prove rather embarrassing for your species' reputation. Jake looked up from making final adjustments to his creation, which now stood nearly 3 meters tall and looked like something that belonged on a medieval battlefield. Professor, I appreciate the concern, but I think you're going to be surprised by what good old-fashioned human engineering can accomplish. Indeed, Professor Quantamara flickered with amusement. I suspect we all will be. As she dematerialized, Jake could have sworn he heard her adding something about updating the practical limitations curriculum for next semester. Jake patted his creation affectionately. Tomorrow, these aliens were going to learn that sometimes the oldest solutions were the best solutions, and that humans had been solving the how do we break things from far away problem for a very, very long time. The testing arena was bigger than Jake had expected, which was perfect because he was going to need the space. What looked like half the university had turned out to watch the advanced applied physics demonstrations, filling floating observation platforms that ringed the enormous chamber. The reinforced Durasteel target sat 50 meters away, gleaming under the arena's harsh lights like metallic challenges to the laws of physics. Professor Quantamara materialized at the center of the arena, her energy form crackling with ceremonial importance. Welcome, students and faculty, to our semester demonstration of projectile propulsion systems. Today, you will witness the application of advanced physics principles by our most promising students. Jake glanced around at his competition and had to admire their work. These weren't amateur-hour science projects. Zorp had constructed what looked like a miniature star contained in a crystalline housing with plasma conduits that pulsed with barely contained energy. Krita's anti-gravity launcher was a work of art, all flowing curves and precise angles that seemed to bend space around itself. Blundik had built something that appeared to violate several fundamental laws of physics just by existing. A massive geometric construct that hummed with contained potential. "We shall proceed in order of species sophistication," Professor Quantamara announced, and Jake bit his tongue to keep from laughing, "beginning with our most advanced theoretical approaches." Zorp went first, his plasma cannon crackling to life with the sound of controlled lightning. The slug-like alien input calculations that scrolled past faster than Jake could read, adjusting electromagnetic field configurations with mathematical precision that was honestly impressive. The weapon charged with a whine that made Jake's teeth itch. "Plasma bolt initialized," Zorp gurgled with obvious pride. "Energy output calculated at 47,000 kilojoules. Target destruction probability approaches certainty." The plasma bolt launched in a brilliant streak of superheated matter that lit up the entire arena. It struck the durasteel target dead center and punched through it like tissue paper, leaving a perfectly circular hole that glowed white-hot around the edges. The crowd made appreciative noises in 17 different languages. "Excellent demonstration." Professor Quantamara's form brightened with approval. "Clean energy transfer, minimal waste heat, textbook plasma physics application." Krita stepped up next, her anti-gravity launcher floating serenely a meter off the ground. Her projectile was a sphere of crystallized antimatter, contained in magnetic fields that made reality shimmer around it. When she fired, the projectile simply ceased to exist in one location and reappeared, impacting the target, which promptly folded in on itself like origami made of metal. "Quantum tunneling with gravitational manipulation," Krita clicked with satisfaction. "The target experienced localized space-time distortion, resulting in molecular restructuring. Impact velocity was effectively instantaneous." The crowd was genuinely impressed now. Even Jake had to admit, these weren't your typical college physics projects. Lundok's turn came with geological ceremony. His device defied easy description, appearing to be a chunk of his homeworld's crust reconfigured into something that hurt to look at directly. When activated, it launched a projectile that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Hyperdimensional kinetic transfer," Blundek rumbled with obvious satisfaction. "Projectile achieved impact through alternative spatial geometries. Target destruction occurred across 17 parallel timelines simultaneously." The target simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not vaporized, just gone, leaving behind a perfectly target-shaped absence in reality. "Extraordinary," Professor Quantamara pulsed with academic excitement. "I see our advanced students have truly grasped the sophisticated principles of modern physics." Then all eyes turned to Jake. His trebuchet stood in stark contrast to everything that had come before. 3 meters of honest wood and metal, counterweights and cables, looking like something archaeologists might find in a museum dedicated to primitive warfare. Next to plasma cannons and reality-warping hyperdimensional devices, it looked almost embarrassingly simple. The crowd had gone quiet, but Jake could feel the anticipation. This was either going to be spectacular or spectacularly embarrassing. "And now," Professor Quantamara's tone carried just a hint of condescension, "our exchange student will demonstrate human engineering principles." Jake walked over to his trebuchet and ran his hand along the throwing arm, feeling the perfectly balanced weight distribution he'd spent days calibrating. He'd loaded it with what looked like an oversized bowling ball made of the densest material the university's fabricators could produce. "This is my gravitational potential energy conversion system," Jake announced to the crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the arena. "The operational principle is pretty straightforward. I use mechanical advantage to store energy in an elevated counterweight, then convert that stored potential energy into kinetic energy through controlled release." He could hear alien students giggling in the observation platforms. Someone made a comment about rocks and sticks that got a big laugh. "The beauty of this system," Jake continued, completely unfazed, "is that it's been field-tested extensively. We've had thousands of years to work out the bugs, optimize the mechanics, and perfect the engineering. This isn't theoretical physics, folks. This is applied engineering with a proven track record." He moved to the release mechanism, a simple lever that looked almost crude compared to the energy matrices and quantum controllers his classmates had used. The projectile weighs approximately 50 kilograms. The counterweight is calibrated at 800 kilograms. The throwing arm provides a mechanical advantage of approximately 4-to-1, and the whole system is designed to convert stored gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy with maximum efficiency. Professor Quantamara's form flickered with what Jake was pretty sure was impatience. Yes, human Jake, we understand the basic mechanical principles. Perhaps you could proceed with the demonstration? Jake grinned and gripped the release lever. Oh, I'm just getting started, Professor. See, the thing about human engineering is that we don't just build things to work. We build them to work reliably, efficiently, and with enough power to get the job done. He pulled the lever. The counterweight dropped with a sound like thunder. The throwing arm whipped forward with mechanical precision that had been perfected over centuries of medieval warfare. The projectile launched from the cup with a velocity that made the air crack like a whip. The sound it made when it hit the target wasn't the clean energy discharge of a plasma bolt or the reality-warping whisper of quantum tunneling. It was the deep, satisfying crunch of kinetic energy meeting matter and winning decisively. The Durasteel target didn't just break, it exploded. Fragments of reinforced metal scattered across the arena floor like confetti, leaving behind a crater in the backstop that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. The arena went completely silent. Jake walked over to examine the remains of what had been a supposedly indestructible target, picking up a piece of twisted metal that was still warm from the impact. Kinetic energy transfer, he said conversationally to the stunned crowd. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. In the observation platforms, alien students were staring with expressions that transcended species barriers. Zorp had left a trail of mathematical equations behind him as his brain tried to process what he'd just witnessed. Krita's multifaceted eyes were calculating impact forces that didn't seem possible from such a simple mechanical system. Blunduk was taking very careful notes about primitive human energy conversion efficiency. Professor Quantamara materialized next to the crater, her energy form flickering through several colors that Jake didn't think were good signs. That was, she began, then stopped, started again. The kinetic energy transfer was... Another pause. How did you achieve such devastating impact force with such a rudimentary system? Jake shrugged, trying to look modest. Well, Professor, like I said, we've had a lot of time to perfect the engineering. This particular design has been used to knock down castle walls, break siege defenses, and generally ruin people's day for about 1,000 years. We got pretty good at making them work. The silence stretched on until Professor Vextalen's voice cut through the arena like a bureaucratic knife. I demand an immediate review of the weapons policy regulations. Professor Vextalan materialized in the arena so fast Jake was pretty sure he'd violated several traffic laws in the process. His filing cabinet body was clicking and whirring with bureaucratic panic, mandibles working overtime as he consulted what appeared to be every regulation manual in the university's database. This is highly irregular, Vextalan announced, his voice carrying the particular kind of outrage reserved for administrators who discover their carefully crafted rules have been turned into origami. I specifically stated that firearms were prohibited on campus grounds. Jake picked up another piece of the obliterated target, examining it with the casual interest of someone who just solved a physics problem that had been bothering him. Well, sure, Professor, but this isn't a firearm. It most certainly is a weapon. Vextalen's sensors were scanning the trebuchet from every conceivable angle, searching for some violation he could cite. It launches projectiles with destructive force. So did theirs, Jake pointed at the other students' devices. Zorp's plasma cannon literally punched a hole through reinforced Durasteel. Kurita folded reality around her target. Blunduk made his target stop existing across 17 dimensions. But nobody's calling those firearms. Professor Quantamara flickered between several colors as she processed this logic. The difference, human Jake, is that their devices utilize sophisticated energy manipulation and advanced physics principles, while yours employs crude mechanical force. Exactly my point, Jake said, warming to his argument. Professor Vextalan specifically defined firearms as devices that use chemical combustion to propel projectiles. No combustion here, just good old-fashioned physics. Gravity, mechanical advantage, kinetic energy transfer. Isaac Newton would be proud. Vextalen's mandibles were clicking so fast they sounded like a machine gun. The intent of the regulation was clearly to prohibit destructive projectile weapons. But that's not what the regulation actually says, Jake replied, and his tone had shifted into something that would have been familiar to any lawyer in the galaxy. The regulation specifically prohibits chemical combustion-based projectile systems. This is a gravitational potential energy conversion system, utilizing mechanical advantage for kinetic energy transfer. Completely different physics. Blunduck raised a massive stone hand. For clarification, human Jake is technically correct. The regulatory language contains no restrictions on mechanical energy storage systems, gravitational potential conversion, or kinetic energy transfer mechanisms. Thank you, Blunduck, Jake nodded appreciatively. See, the thing is, you all assumed that primitive meant ineffective, but humans have been in the projectile business for a really long time. We started with throwing rocks, moved up to slings, then bows, then catapults, then trebuchets, then cannons, then railguns. Each step was an improvement on the last, but the basic principle never changed. Apply force to object. Object goes fast. Object hits target. Target has bad day. Zorp gurgled nervously, leaving acidic trails as he shifted. But human Jake, your device appears to violate the fundamental assumption that technological advancement requires increased complexity. Does it, though? Jake walked over to his trebuchet, patting the throwing arm affectionately. This thing has moving parts I can count on my fingers. No exotic matter, no antimatter containment, no hyperdimensional geometries. Just wood, metal, rope, and physics. But it's been optimized through literally centuries of battlefield testing. Krita's eyes were calculating at superhuman speed. The kinetic energy transfer efficiency is remarkably high for such a mechanically simple system. Right? That's because every component is designed for one thing, converting stored energy into projectile velocity as efficiently as possible. No wasted energy on fancy light shows or reality warping, just pure, focused kinetic transfer. Professor Quantamara was cycling through colors Jake was pretty sure weren't visible to most species. But this completely undermines the philosophical basis of our advanced physics curriculum. How so? Jake asked innocently. You wanted a projectile propulsion system that could destroy a reinforced target at 50 meters without using chemical combustion. I delivered exactly that. The fact that I used principles that are a few thousand years old doesn't change the physics. It changes everything. Professor Quantamara's form was now pulsing an alarming shade of ultraviolet. If simple mechanical systems can achieve the same results as advanced energy manipulation, then what's the point of technological sophistication? Jake considered this seriously. Well, Professor, I'd say the point is that different solutions work for different problems. Your students built some genuinely impressive devices that can do things my trebuchet never could. Zorp's plasma cannon can probably fire continuously with variable energy output. Krita's quantum system can hit targets through solid barriers. Blunduck's hyperdimensional device can strike across multiple timelines. He gestured at his trebuchet. This thing? It throws one rock at a time, takes a minute to reload, and requires manual recalibration for different ranges. But it's reliable, it's maintainable with basic tools, and it hits hard enough to ruin anyone's day. Different tools for different jobs. The arena had filled with murmuring aliens as word spread about the human's demonstration. Jay could see faculty members consulting regulations, students frantically recalculating their assumptions about primitive technology, and what looked like several species military attachés taking very detailed notes. Professor Vextalon had been scrolling through regulations with increasing desperation, his sensors working overtime. Finally, he looked up with the expression of someone who just realized he'd been outmaneuvered by superior tactics. I find no regulatory violations, he admitted with obvious reluctance. The device uses no chemical combustion, no banned energy systems, no prohibited materials. It falls within the technical parameters of allowed mechanical engineering projects. But I am adding a new regulation immediately, he continued, his voice rising to bureaucratic heights. Effective immediately, all projectile systems with kinetic energy transfer exceeding? He paused, consulting his sensors. What exactly was the impact force of that demonstration? Jake scratched his head thoughtfully. Well, 50 kilograms at roughly 60 meters per second gives you about 90,000 joules of kinetic energy. Pretty standard for a well-built trebuchet, actually. Medieval siege engineers would have been disappointed if it delivered less. 90,000 joules. Vextalon's entire body was clicking like a typewriter having a nervous breakdown. That exceeds the destructive capability of standard military sidearms. Yeah, that's kind of the point, Jake said. Trebuchets were designed to knock down fortifications. They're siege weapons. We built them to break things that really didn't want to be broken. Professor Quantamara materialized directly in front of Jake, her energy form crackling with what he was learning to recognize as academic crisis. Human Jake, do you understand what you've done? You've demonstrated that millennia of technological advancement can be matched by what your species would consider medieval engineering. Jake shrugged. Not matched, Professor. Different approaches to the same problem. Your student solutions are more versatile, more precise, more controllable. Mine's just more direct. And that's the problem, she exclaimed. Direct shouldn't work this well. Physics should favor complexity and sophistication. Physics doesn't care about complexity, Professor, Jake said gently. Physics cares about getting the job done. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Sometimes it's not. The trick is knowing which situation you're in. Blundock had been taking notes throughout this entire exchange. Now he raised his massive hand again. For the record, Human Jake has achieved the highest destructive efficiency rating in the class while using the lowest tech solution. This suggests that human engineering philosophy may warrant further academic study. Absolutely not, Vextalin declared. I'm implementing new regulations immediately. No mechanical energy storage systems exceeding, he paused again, clearly realizing the problem with trying to regulate physics itself. Jake grinned. You could try limiting projectile mass, but then someone might just build a bigger trebuchet. Or limit energy storage, but that affects anti-gravity systems too. Or limit mechanical advantage, but that breaks most of the engineering equipment on campus. The human makes a valid point, Krita observed. Any regulation specific enough to prohibit his device would also restrict legitimate engineering applications. Professor Quantamara began cycling through colors again, this time in what Jake suspected was the academic equivalent of a panic attack. This is unprecedented. We need to convene the faculty senate. We need to review the entire curriculum. We need to give the human his grade, Blundock interrupted with geological patience. He successfully completed the assignment parameters with exceptional results. Academic regulations require recognition of superior performance. The silence that followed was the kind that made Jake wonder if he'd accidentally started an interdisciplinary incident. Finally, Professor Quantamara stabilized at a resigned shade of blue. Human Jake, for your creative interpretation of assignment parameters and your effective demonstration of kinetic energy transfer, you receive full marks. She paused, her form flickering with what might have been curiosity. Though I must ask, do humans have many other primitive technologies that achieve similar results? Jake's grin could have powered the campus for a week. Professor, we've got about 10,000 years of creative problem-solving to draw from. This is just siege warfare. Wait until you see what we came up with for naval combat. Word traveled fast in a university filled with species that communicated through quantum entanglement, pheromone trails, and telepathic networks. By the time Jake made it back to his dormitory, his communication device was buzzing with enough messages to crash a small server farm. The first message was from a graduate student in applied xenobiology. Human Jake, I have heard of your primitive projectile demonstration. My research involves studying predator-prey relationships across 17 star systems. Would you be available to discuss human hunting methodologies? The second was from the Department of Historical Warfare Studies. Mr. Morrison, we would very much like to interview you about human military innovations. We are particularly interested in something called Greek fire that appears in your databases. The third made Jake laugh out loud. Dear primitive engineering consultant, I am designing a mining operation for a high-gravity world where energy weapons are impractical. Could we discuss human excavation techniques? I am especially curious about something called controlled explosions. His door chimed, and Jake opened it to find Zorp, Krita, and Bloontalk standing in the hallway, while Bloontalk was more filling the hallway, but the intent was the same. Human Jake, Zorp gurgled, leaving apologetic acid trails on the floor. We have come to request clarification on human engineering principles. Specifically, Krita clicked with what Jake was learning to recognize as academic excitement. We wish to understand how your species achieved such efficiency with mechanical systems. Bloomdoke rumbled in his geological voice. I have calculated that your trebuchet achieved a 94.7% energy transfer efficiency from counterweight to projectile. This exceeds theoretical maximums for most advanced energy systems. Jake stepped aside to let them in, though he wasn't sure how Blundock was going to fit through the door. The rock person solved this by temporarily reconfiguring his molecular structure to flow through the opening like very determined sand. It's not really that mysterious, Jake said, settling into his chair while his classmates arranged themselves around the room. Humans have been building trebuchets for about 1,000 years. When you spend that long perfecting something, you tend to work out all the inefficiencies. But how did your species know to pursue mechanical advantage instead of energy manipulation? Krita asked. Every other civilization in the galaxy developed energy-based weapons as soon as they discovered controlled fusion. Jake considered this. Well, we discovered controlled fusion pretty recently, galactically speaking. We spent most of our development working with what we had available. Muscle power, gravity, chemical reactions, wind, water flow. We got really good at making mechanical systems work, because that's all we had. Zorp was frantically calculating something, leaving mathematical equations in his slime trail. Human Jake, I have been reviewing your species' technological development timeline. You achieve spaceflight using controlled chemical explosions? Yup. Rockets. Big tubes full of fuel that we set on fire, in a controlled way, to push spacecraft into orbit. That is... Zorp paused, his entire body quivering with what Jake hoped was amazement rather than horror. That is the most aggressively direct approach to spaceflight I have ever encountered. It gets better, Jake grinned. We also figured out how to split atoms and use the energy release for power generation. And before that, we learned to harness steam pressure by boiling water with fire. Humans are really good at taking simple physical principles and scaling them up until they solve whatever problem we're working on. Blundock had been taking careful notes throughout this conversation. Now he looked up with what passed for excitement in a geological entity. Human Jake, would your species' engineering philosophy extend to large-scale construction projects? Oh, absolutely. We've built pyramids, skyscrapers, bridges that span continents, tunnels that go under oceans. We once built a wall that stretches for thousands of kilometers just to keep people on the other side from visiting uninvited. Krita's multifaceted eyes were practically glowing. Your species built physical barriers for territorial control, rather than energy shields or quantum displacement fields? Walls work, Jake shrugged. They're cheap, they're reliable, and they don't need a power source. Plus, if someone does get over your wall, you can always build a bigger wall. His communication device buzzed again, this time with a priority message that made all three of his classmates look up in alarm. Jake read it and started laughing. What is the source of your amusement? Blundock asked with geological patience. I just got a message from the Advanced Warfare Ethics Department. Apparently they want me to guest lecture in their course on asymmetric conflict resolution. Sounds ominous, Zorp gurgled nervously. It gets better. They specifically want to discuss human innovations in what they're calling resource-limited combat scenarios. The class description mentions something about analyzing engagements where technologically superior forces were defeated by primitive tactical adaptation. Krita's mandibles clicked rapidly. Human Jake, exactly how much warfare has your species engaged in over your development period? Jake scratched his head thoughtfully. Well, that's kind of a complicated question. See, humans have been fighting wars pretty much continuously for our entire recorded history. We've gotten really good at it. The silence that followed was the kind that made Jake wonder if he'd said something wrong. Continuously? Blundock asked carefully. Oh yeah. Sometimes we fight over resources, sometimes over territory, sometimes over ideology, sometimes just because we don't like the other guy's face. We've developed tactics for fighting in forests, deserts, mountains, swamps, oceans, underground, in cities, in space, you name it. But surely, Zorp interjected hopefully, your species has moved beyond primitive warfare now that you have advanced technology. Jake's grin was starting to make his classmates nervous. Well, we still have wars, but now they're really interesting wars. We've got cyber warfare, economic warfare, psychological warfare, information warfare, and about 17 different kinds of asymmetric conflict that most species haven't even thought of yet. His communication device chimed again. This time the message made Jake laugh so hard he nearly fell off his chair. What now? Krita asked with obvious apprehension. The Department of Theoretical Physics wants to know if humans have any primitive solutions to faster-than-light travel that don't require exotic matter or space-time manipulation. Jake wiped tears from his eyes. I should probably mention that humans haven't actually solved faster-than-light travel yet. We're still working on that one. Then how did you arrive at this university? Blundock asked. Oh, that was your technology. We just hitched a ride on an alien transport. But now that you mention it, we do have some ideas we've been working on. There's this thing called an Alkebuberry drive that's pretty interesting, and we've got some theories about quantum entanglement that might work. Zorp was leaving increasingly frantic mathematical equations in his trail. Human Jake, your species develops theoretical physics solutions for problems you cannot yet solve practically. Sure, we call it getting ahead of ourselves. It's a human specialty. Another message arrived, this one marked as urgent from the university administration. Jake read it, and his grin became positively predatory. "Okay, this is officially getting fun," he announced. "The university chancellor wants to meet with me personally to discuss expanding the cultural exchange program. Apparently, there's been a sudden surge of interest in human engineering methodologies across 17 different departments." "Is that good?" Krita asked hesitantly. "For me? Definitely. For the university's carefully structured curriculum based on technological sophistication hierarchies?" Jake shrugged. "Probably not so much." He stood up and stretched, looking around at his 3 classmates who had become considerably more respectful in the past few hours. "Look, guys, here's the thing about humans. We don't assume that newer is better, or that complex is superior, or that advanced means effective. We use whatever works, whether it's a 10,000-year-old mechanical principle or cutting-edge theoretical physics. Sometimes the best solution is the one your ancestors figured out. Sometimes it's something nobody's ever thought of before." His communication device buzzed one final time. Jake glanced at it and started laughing again. "What is it now?" Blunduck asked with geological resignation. "Message from the Advanced Warfare Ethics professor. She wants to know if I can define weapon of mass destruction for their next class." Jake looked around at his 3 alien classmates, all of whom were staring at him with expressions that transcended species boundaries. "I should probably start researching that," he said thoughtfully, "just to make sure I understand the parameters correctly." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Zorp frantically calculating the implications of human military creativity, Kriata's mandibles clicking in what might have been prayers to whatever gods insectoid species worshipped, and Blunduck carving what appeared to be a last will and testament into his own rocky surface. Jake Morrison, exchange student from the primitive backwater called Earth, settled back in his chair and started reading about university regulations regarding weapons of mass destruction. He had a feeling this was going to be a very educational semester. After all, humans had been finding loopholes in rules for almost as long as they'd been making trebuchets, and they'd gotten very, very good at both.